So, welcome to the Ops Desk podcast, everybody. I am Paul Morrow, and this week I'm going to start us off by doing something I haven't done before. I'm going to interview myself. And the real reason for it is the fact that I think we are really at an historic inflection point that I want to talk about because we have some video, I think, that demonstrates it very, very clearly. Look, we all know that the Munich Security Conference just occurred over in Europe, and there are a number of takeaways. But the West is at an inflection point. And I'm going to put a name on it. Now, whether you like Donald Trump, whether you don't like Donald Trump, irrespective of that, the facts are the facts. And we are living through what I'm going to call the Trumpian reset. All right? Yeah, the Trumpian reset. Now, what do I mean? Look, historically speaking, and certainly the modern age, and maybe going back to, let's say, at least the Renaissance, it's been the West that has led global developments. I know not exclusively, and I'm not ignoring the contributions of the East, nor the historic and ancient contributions of the East, which are arguably superior to those of the West. But in the, let's say, the modern era, post-Renaissance, maybe even going back to the British Magna Carta, which is in many ways the foundation for not only our own system and our Constitution, but the system of human and civil rights that obtains in most of the Western world and civilized world globally. It has been the West where things have developed, things like the scientific method, leading to the advances in technology, medicine, law, governance. That stuff has come from the West, and it's stuff that we take for granted. And yeah, we take it for granted, and that's why the Trumpian reset. Let's do a little bit of quick history. World War I was probably the first great cataclysm of modern era in the West where all of this was severely tested, but in many ways it was strengthened coming out of that. Why? Because World War I is really what put an end to the West's structure based around royal families. You had the Habsburgs, you had the Kaiser in Germany. Those systems went away after World War I, and however unsuccessful it was in Germany, you had a washing out of the old system of kingdoms. And again, the march of civil and human rights that, again, we take for granted. Now, the next great crisis, of course, was World War II, which many people feel was just the second battle of World War I because of unresolved issues from World War I. Whether you buy that or not, irrespective of that, World War II created a great shift in the West. And what was that? The old colonial powers, the powers from the age of exploration, England, France, Germany, Portugal, Italy, all of those were put on the back shelf compared to America. It was World War II where I know we were dispositive and very key in World War I. Our entry into World War I likely put an end to that great conflict. But World War II is where the full might of America was really on display and where America really stepped onto the world stage as the great power globally in the world, but also certainly in the West. And the divide that came out of that, I know it started in World War I with the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 in the East, in Russia, of course. But by the time you were out of World War II, the battle lines were clearly drawn. In the East, you had communism, as exemplified in China and Russia, and certain other places like, for instance, ultimately in Vietnam and Cambodia. But in the West, you had all the stuff that I'm talking about, civil rights, human rights, and advances in technology that the Eastern nations simply could not match because of communism, because of their inward-looking system that stepped on the innovation and ambition of the citizenry, subjugated to the greater good that communism demands. Now, I go into all of this history because it demonstrates where we are now. World War II, of course, led to the Cold War, which by any metric, the United States, the West, Western Europe, won. Europe had been divided along East and West, with the Soviet Union on one side, and of course we forget that maybe it was not exactly part of the Cold War the way we perceive it, but you had Maoist China always off there on our flank in the Cold War. and then, of course, the Soviet Union. And then on the other side, you had the West led by America. And by any metric, the West won. The Soviet Union collapsed. We see that communism in China these days is more just autocracy. And the West succeeded. The Western system proved itself to be superior in pretty much every way: efficiency, advancements, and so on. And yet, as a result of that, we have become completely complacent. The West has taken for granted all of the things that led to the Western system being demonstrated as superior. Now, the bulwark, the thing that was the frontier, that held the frontier against the East and the advance of this imbecilic communism, was constituted in NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, we have not asked a lot of NATO in America here. 2% of GDP is supposed to go to national defense. Donald Trump is trying to get it to 5%, but the signatories have not gone for that. You don't hear that much about it anymore. 2% of the national gross domestic product of the NATO members is supposed to go to national defense. Eastern Europe, since having been liberated from the Soviets, generally adheres to that. Why? Because they're closer to the flame being, of course, a newly expansionist Russia under a messianic Vladimir Putin. But the Western nations play all kinds of games with this. Germany has bragged about the fact that it'll never reach the 2%, although now ostensibly they have, but it goes to the fact that they use all kinds of workarounds. Pensions for their soldiers, dual-use equipment. There's a whole series of things that they use to supposedly match and hit the 2% of GDP that is supposed to go to their security, and yet doesn't, because they're playing with the numbers. Now, they're not all Poland, which really gets it, and which is right at the front doorstep of Putin's Russia, and who I would argue is right now among our most important allies in all of Europe and all the world. But Western Europe still seems not to get it. And as a result, the Trumpian reset. Now, I think if you could go to one moment where this was most clearly seen in relief, it was in 2017. Donald Trump addressing the UN about the Western European reliance on Russian oil. And one thing about Trump, as I said, like him or not, he's going to put it to you straight. And he told that gathered crowd, you are going to be held hostage by Russian oil. And the German delegation was filmed laughing at him. Is it any wonder that Donald Trump seems to hold the greatest disdain he has for some of the Western nations? Because he is undeniably really rough on them. All right, you saw it with the negotiations with Denmark relative to Greenland. But from the president's perspective, and from the perspective of what, in my estimation, should have been the perspective of Western presidents, the Western European nations have not been holding up their end. Now, a quick story. When I was I did a grad degree at Harvard. Up at Harvard, I had a former UN ambassador as an advisor. And this never came up in any of the national security classes I took up there, with some of the main principles, bold-faced names. I'm not going to say it, but bold-faced names that have been in the mix on these negotiations, have been ambassadors to various European nations. None of this ever came up. And so right now, somehow or other, out of some sense of guilt, some sense of anti-colonialism, but more than anything else, from the march of Marxism that has still holds sway somehow or other, still is embedded in the collective medulla of academia in the West. Marxism somehow or other still has a hold on our chattering classes. And that is what the Trumpian reset is trying to undo. Trump and Rubio particularly get the fact in a Reagan-esque way. They understand that, you know what? Yeah, the Berlin Wall fell, but it's the kind of thing that can happen again if we don't keep an eye on it. And for whatever reason, Western Europe seems to find all of this just way too much to countenance. They find it truculent, belligerent, warlike, and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, Putin is doing everything he can to march west. And this is why the Trumpian reset right now is underway. Trump went in as the bad cop. And that's why he seems to be pretty uninterested in Western Europe's take on Greenland. Now, here at the Ops Desk, we recognize the strategic value to all of American safety and security of Greenland. And we have a documentary, we've put out the audio, we're going to be putting out a video version of that explores the history of Greenland is not what you're being told by the mainstream media. It is not at this time, somehow or other, America going in as the bully and snatching Greenland away from a benevolent Denmark. The story is a lot more complicated and a lot more unseemly on the part of the Europeans. You don't hear about that, but you will from us. But as part of the Trumpian reset, Donald Trump went in, as I said, as the bad cop, and he told them, look, you got to square yourselves away here. You got to recognize that we're not going to be a big brother forever. You can't spend your money on things that you want to and then expect us to guarantee your security. By America propping up NATO, what we've really done is allowed them to create welfare states that essentially we're paying for as a pass-through. And so as a result, what have they done? They've opened their borders, they've created cradle-to-grave welfare states, and as part of that, they have begun to abandon their own cultural birthright. So, Trump has told them, you better wise up, and then he essentially leaves town, and they're all shaken up. Now, I have a lot of sourcing in this area, but you don't need it. You just read the papers, you know what's going on. The Western Europeans and even some of the Eastern Europeans are very shaken up because they feel like maybe we can't rely on America anymore. And I'm not so sure that's such a bad thing. That doesn't mean they won't be allies. They are our allies and they have to stay our allies. But it is time for them to step up themselves. No, you can't say that you're entirely going to rely on us so you can have cradle-to-grave benefits for people who weren't even born in your country and are now changing the cultures of your country. So, the Munich conference and the speech that, in my estimation, it represents a great move forward, hopefully anyway, a great inflection point, if nothing else, in transatlantic relations. The speech that Marco Rubio gave at the Munich conference, if you were paying attention to the news, you've probably caught some of it. We have the salient 3 minutes of it that I'm going to play now. If you care about this stuff, you care about security of the West, this is, in my estimation, a Churchillian speech. Marco Rubio over the weekend at the Munich Security Conference. Here we go.
For 5 centuries before the end of the Second World War, the West had been expanding. Its missionaries, its pilgrims, its soldiers, its explorers pouring out from its shores to cross oceans, settle new continents, build vast empires extending out across the globe. But in 1945, for the first time since the age of Columbus, it was contracting. Europe was in ruins. Half of it lived behind an iron curtain, and the rest looked like it would soon follow. The great Western empires had entered into terminal decline, accelerated by godless communist revolutions and by anti-colonial uprisings that would transform the world and drape the red hammer and sickle across vast swaths of the map in the years to come. Against that backdrop, then as now, many came to believe that the West's age of dominance had come to an end, and that our future was destined to be a faint and feeble echo of our past. But together, our predecessors recognized that decline was a choice, and it was a choice they refused to make. This is what we did together once before, and this is what President Trump and the United States want to do again now, together with you. And this is why we do not want our allies to be weak, because that makes us weaker. We want allies who can defend themselves so that no adversary will ever be tempted to test our collective strength. This is why we do not want our allies to be shackled by guilt and shame. We want allies who are proud of their culture and of their heritage, who understand that we are heirs to the same great and noble civilization, and who together with us are willing and able to defend it. And this is why we do not want allies to rationalize the broken status quo rather than reckon with what is necessary to fix it. For we in America have no interest in being polite and orderly caretakers of the West's managed decline. We do not seek to separate, but to revitalize an old friendship and renew the greatest civilization in human history. What we want is a reinvigorated alliance that recognizes that what has ailed our societies is not just a set of bad policies, but a malaise of hopelessness and complacency. An alliance the alliance that we want is one that is not paralyzed into inaction by fear. Fear of climate change, fear of war, fear of technology. Instead, we want an alliance that boldly races into the future. And the only fear we have is the fear of the shame of not leaving our nations prouder, stronger, and wealthier for our children. An alliance ready to defend our people, to safeguard our interests, and to preserve the freedom of action that allows us to shape our own destiny. Not one that exists to operate a global welfare state and atone for the purported sins of past generations. An alliance that does not allow its power to be outsourced, constrained, or subordinated to systems beyond its control. One that does not depend on others for the critical necessities of its national life. And one that does not maintain the polite pretense that our way of life is just one among many, and that asks for permission before it acts. And above all, an alliance based on the recognition that we, the West, have inherited together. What we have inherited together is something that is unique and distinctive and irreplaceable. Because this, after all, is the very foundation of the transatlantic bond.
So Rubio hits all the points that I feel are being abdicated by the Western European nations these days, and that I think that they're going to have to face, or they are managing their own decline. First of all, migration. They've thrown open their borders, and they're losing their cultures. I can remember going back about 10, 15 years, of all people, Brigitte Bardot, talking about, who just passed away, rest in peace, but she actually said, we're losing France. We're losing French culture here. And she was vilified. And this is 10, 15 years ago, she said this, and she was characterized in the world media as a kook. No, she just saw what was happening before anybody else. And as I said, we paid for open borders here in America. We're still paying for it and trying to rectify it. But by proxy, by supporting and paying for the security of Western Europe, we've paid for their open borders because they've blown open their borders and they're losing their culture across the board. What's going on in the UK, I can't believe. This is the nation that stood up to Hitler without America, who managed to bloody his nose and hold him off, who managed to do the evacuation from Dunkirk and fight another day, the nation of Churchill. This is that nation. They're lying down for this. They're losing their country. And it's going on across the board. I can tell you, somebody used to go over there on cases all the time. The last time I went to Germany, in Frankfurt, I didn't recognize it, all right? It was vastly, vastly different. He also talked about their economic outsourcing. Now, that's what's going on here. The tariffs are part of it. But the Western European nations, and the Eastern European nations as well, but primarily the Western European nations, are outsourcing all of their manufacturing, all of their vital supply chains to Asia, primarily China. And in the same way that they put themselves beholden to Russian oil, they put themselves beholden to supply chains that go to China. Say what you want again about Donald Trump. He recognizes at least that we cannot be beholden to China for vital medicines, for the rare earth minerals. And that is part of the Great Reset, the reawakening and the reconfirming of the West. That the West is not something to be ashamed of, and in fact, it's something to be proud of. It should be celebrated, and it needs to be protected. But instead, you see Western Europe choosing cultural suicide. And then the last thing, of course, is security, as represented in NATO. Now, look, the budgets there have to increase, period, end of story, no matter how much pain there is. Because you've seen it right now. America has a carrier group off the coast of Iran with a second one incoming. A single, if you've watched the Ops Desk podcasts, a single, as per Captain Morgan, who talked to us about, former Navy, now Navy reserves, talked to us about the power of that aircraft carrier group. One aircraft carrier group has more firepower than pretty much any European nation writ large. One has more power than entire nations in Europe. Never mind two of them. Two aircraft carrier groups, which is what we're going to have off the coast of Iran shortly, is going to be more power likely than the collective NATO powers in Europe, with the possible exception of some of the stuff in the East, where, as I said, they feel closer to the Russian flame. Now, look, we face more than just Russia. As I said, this is a West and East divide. I am not advocating war. I don't want it. Nobody wants it. Even Donald Trump, people tried to say when he was being elected, he's warlike and everything else. But you know what? You got to say one thing about him. He is not a warmonger. But the divide is West-East. And it's Russia and it's China, as it was during the Cold War. I would say that in terms of supremacy, they have shifted. All right, they've switched. Russia used to be the big dog. Now China is the big dog, but it doesn't mean Russia is not a problem. They are obviously very adversarial, and they have the world's biggest, most numerous nuclear stockpiles. But when it comes to China, we have to recognize that that is our great global rival. And as we reset the West to face China, the great touch point, the hot button, is clearly Taiwan. Taiwan is an American ally. We're not even allowed to call them China. You're not allowed to. You have to be very careful about how you refer to them, because China is convinced that they're a province of theirs. So you have to refer to them in certain ways. The Chinese lose their mind. They protest. They're unbelievably touchy about it. That is the space right there where the America-China West-East divide comes home. And in the American view, Taiwan is essentially the world's biggest aircraft carrier. And right now they are arming as fast as they can, with America's help, buying a lot of American munitions, so that if China does decide at some point that they're going to roll in there to try to take it back, which would be a sign of desperation, which I think would only happen if Xi really felt like he was losing control of his own country, which is possible, that at least it's a poison pill where they wish they had never done it and they can't hold it. And that's a discussion for another time. We've had people on the podcast to discuss it. But this is probably, in terms of the East-West divide in foreign policy, the most significant and important hot-button touch point in all of global affairs. And let's look at how arguably the leading candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination in the next president election, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC. Let's see how she handles a question about Taiwan.
And the U.S. actually commit U.S. troops to defend Taiwan if China were to move?
I think that this is such a, I think that this is this is, of course, a very long-standing policy of the United States. And I think what we are hoping for is that we want to make sure that we never get to that point. And we want to make sure that we are moving in all of our economic research and our global positions to avoid any such confrontation and for that question to even arise.
Great, huh? Compare that to the speech that Rubio just gave, which, by the way, he apparently wrote most of himself. So that is the president, ostensibly the president-elect that the Democrats want, a person who can barely define what the equities are relative to Taiwan, who doesn't, I think, even understand what's going on relative to East-West, this reset that Donald Trump is attempting in global affairs to reset Americans' allies so that we can maintain the West's supremacy, hardening this hemisphere relative to Latin America with Venezuela, Colombia, Cuba, I believe, about to fall and potentially to come back into the first world of nations, right? 90 miles off of Florida. I mean, that place is going to look like Palm Beach in a generation if they just get rid of communism. because that has been the great depressor there. Okay? She doesn't seem to have a clue. Let's look at maybe the leading candidate for the Democratic nomination next time around in 2028, the great Gavin Newsom.
You're running around distributing knee pads to CEOs, and I think it does.
Handing them out.
And it
does.
I
do have a few, if you'd like.
And
I don't know.
And honestly, it sounds.
By the way, I'm not kidding. They're the new Trump signature series knee pads. Yeah, and they are available online. I told you the last one sold out. And I just want to sort of. It's a serious moment. It actually. But we laugh. Anyway, these are available and in bulk too.
Knee pads, Governor knee pads. Here he is in Europe. This is him in Europe talking security with the Europeans. Okay, he made a wisecrack to the Germans over at the Munich conference. He invited himself to the. First of all, I don't understand why AOC is there to begin with. Number one, and Newsom, he has yet to build 1 foot of this train to nowhere that he is supposed to be building. That's already one of the most expensive civic projects in world history. Not a foot of that train, and the Palace Days remains a smoking ruin. None of that has been rebuilt. And he's running around, and it was the second time he's gone over to Europe to try to position himself as a statesman at a global level. And he, by the way, does everything he can to cozy up to China. And again, that's another podcast, but if you look at Newsom's behavior relative to China, he has set himself up as almost a vassal state. All right, the Silicon Valley is the way Silicon Valley deals with China, from my estimation, is a security risk that we really should be looking at. And I hope the FBI is all over it, just as they've been looking at these Confucius institutes in our colleges. It all comes out of California. And then finally, we have to look at the last great contender for, and actually right now, according to the polls, the leading contender for the Democratic nomination for president in 2028, you know her, is Kamala.
We are going to the border. We've been to the border. So this whole thing about the border, we've been to the border. We've been to the border.
You haven't been to the border.
And I haven't been to Europe. And I mean, I don't understand the point that you're making.
We've been to the border. We've been to the border. Of course, at that point, she had never been to the border. Ultimately, she went. They did a photo op at the border, and she left. The border czar. Look, that issue's been adjudicated. Trump won that one. There's no two ways about it. It's why he won the election, in my estimation. And right now, of course, the border is more secure than it ever has been. But it's part of the same non-seriousness, unseriousness about global affairs. Look, as president, one of your primary mandates is to run foreign policy through the Secretary of State, sure, but you're the last word. And you better have a vision for it. Donald Trump can be mercurial. The tariffs are on this day, they come back the next day, I'll cut 10% of it because we're making a deal. He's a deal maker, that's how he runs it. Is that the best way to do it? I'm not sure, but that's not the point. The point is, at least he has a vision. You got AOC, who doesn't seem to know where Taiwan is, saying that Venezuela is south of the equator, which it's not. It's quite close to America. You got Newsom playing around with knee pads like he's in high school. And you got Kamala, who adheres to exactly what Western Europe has done that's leading to their demise. All right? That's leading to the degradation of their culture, their civic life. Elon Musk has launched something like 10 times as many satellites as the entire continent of Europe. Europe has no AI industry. They have no Silicon Valley. They seem to have decided to infantilize their entire system, subjugate it to American security guarantees, and watch the entire continent slip into obsolescence. It is not an exaggeration to say that the Trumpian reset is trying to wake them up to see if they can save themselves, and in doing it, save the future of the West. I'm Paul Morrow with the Ops Desk.